All right. As Kim introduced me, my name is Jordan, and I'll be going ahead and talking about CalARP, RMP, PSM changes. I'm going to focus a little bit as well and give a little bit more background, especially on mechanical integrity, management of change, and operating procedures. Like I said, here's the key topics. Element overlap, periodic requirements, and just a high level, and then common program deficiencies we've seen. Here's the program overlap. It's a nice, easy matrix. You can see while we have 4 different types of regulations, almost everything is across the board. You have the same sort of elements, especially at the program 3 level. Your periodic requirements, obviously you have annual reviews and updates, operating procedures. I'll talk quite a bit about that, but that's one of the biggest ones I always see is very rarely are you getting that annual recertification and revalidation on your operating procedures, as well as your emergency plan. Triennially, you always have refresher training. You can do it more frequently, but at least every 3 years, and as well as that triennial compliance audit. Every 5 years, you have your CalARP or RMP submittal. You have to redo as part of that your hazard analysis or offsite consequence analysis and your PHA. And in California, depending on where your facility is at, there are kind of varying requirements on your seismic assessment. Talk to your CUPA about that, but as a rule of thumb, this is going in with that as well as other external event analysis. Common program deficiencies. These are things that our company has noted while we were doing compliance auditing as well as other program upkeep elements, and also things that we kind of noticed. As you guys know, January 1st, they rolled out a new revision of the CalARP regulations. The changes are subtle, but they are things that can pretty easily trip people up. So we'll also go ahead and kind of denote those as where it's applicable. With regards to your submittal, obviously the biggest deficiency you can have, not getting it completed and submitted within your timely manner. Another one, this is obviously a little bit less straightforward, but not having a management system in place. If you read this, you have to have an org chart, responsibilities, not just saying, hey, there's somebody up here. If he's delineating responsibility, make sure that you note that where it's applicable. A lot of times, especially in a larger company, you might have your general manager or someone like that that's up the top of the org chart. They'll have the overall responsibility, but maybe your maintenance manager is going ahead and taking care of mechanical integrity in some elements. When you guys are doing things like that, make sure that those are clearly noted. It helps regulators understand how you guys are going to go ahead and upkeep your program. Also, it helps from an organizational standpoint because everyone kind of knows here is what I'm responsible for, not, okay, well, this is probably his responsibility, but there's no delineation that says, yes, I am directly responsible for that. Another one, it's less common, but it's very often when this does happen, not to be taken care of, which is making sure that you're updating your contact information or your ownership. Say your safety manager or your general manager leaves, he was the emergency contact. A lot of times that's not caught until you're redoing your CalARP submittal. It needs to be changed as soon as possible. Also, these changes of ownership, it is a very important thing to say, that doesn't restart your 5-year cycle. Unless you're going ahead and completely re-registering, it's not going to affect your dates or anything like that. From a hazardous assessment, a description of your alternative release scenario is not available. This is the biggest one I've ever noticed. You'll see, 15 pounds over 60 minutes. Well, how did you get to that 15 pounds? What was this credible alternative release scenario for you? Was it a valve packing leak? Did you have a loading hose failure? Where did you guys get this number from? And how did you arrive at your quantity release? That's one of the biggest ones we notice. Also, not picking your worst case or alternative release scenarios per the regulation. I've seen a lot of times where people just pick an arbitrary number that is pretty close to maybe an alternative release, but they're not documenting, once again, what that description of that thing was available. Revalidation of it. This is another one. Failure to update the population count. The software is given. It's freeware. You can very easily get a hold of it, but while a lot of people think that we haven't changed our inventory, so that hasn't changed our offsite consequence analysis. While it may not have changed your endpoints, it has your population's changed around you in 5-10 years. So you need to be making sure that you're going ahead and modeling that every time you go ahead and do that hazard assessment. And it's the same thing, sensitive receptors. Maybe some of the businesses around you have opened or closed, and making sure that you have that, as well as kind of like the CalARP submittal, making sure you have that the correct contact information, the correct names, and everything like that. It just helps with the emergency response if anything were to happen. PSI, one of the main ones, not having your P&IDs. Either you might have had them when you guys initially built the system, you guys have modified it since, and then those P&IDs aren't indicative of the system that you have in place right now. Also, a lot of times they're just missing, or you're missing a page or two. They got pulled out of the binder to make a copy, they never made it back in there. Lacking documentation. One of the main ones and the most common ones I see is lacking a relief system design basis. This is a very important one. Basically, it's very important you have those relief systems. However, if you don't have a document that says, okay, this was the basis we chose and this is why we're comfortable with this size PSV, obviously it's not really, you can't really rely on it functioning properly. Compliance with RAGAGEP. I'll touch base a little bit more on this, but this is kind of a hot button for FedOSHA. They released an interpretation letter in July that was kind of talking about how you can document this. So this is something that they're starting to look a little bit more in depth at and making sure that you're documenting that you're in line with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. Electrical area classifications and distribution systems. Oftentimes this is missing. Chemical reactivity and corrosivity hazards. A lot of times this is covered in your MSDS sheet. You can call it out explicitly, but if you don't have your MSDS sheets or it's incomplete, a lot of times you'll see that. And codes and standards used during design. This is a very difficult one to chase down, so if you are looking at it, you think you're deficient in that, get on it earlier rather than later because they're only going to get more out of date. That'll get more confusing as you continue to drag it on. And information not kept up to date. This is the same sort of thing that I was talking about with the P&IDs. You change your system. When you're changing that system, you need to be changing your PSI. Process hazard analysis. One of the main ones I notice, and this is a pretty minor one, but PHA not conducted by knowledgeable personnel in engineering and operations. This kind of goes on two ways. One, your team. As a facilitator, you're there to kind of guide the discussion and make sure that the methodology is used correctly. You can apply some technology, like things that you've seen other places, some of your technical expertise, but you really need those day-to-day operators and the engineer that's been at that plant for years that has that just innate knowledge of that particular system that can go ahead and tell you exactly what you're looking at. Also, the other side of that being, you might have a great team, but if you don't have somebody that's familiar with the methodology, you can run into just as many issues because you don't have somebody that's following the rules or you're not documenting things properly. With that, PHA team not being documented, this is a big deficiency a lot of times that I see. They'll just print out the worksheets and then they'll just put them in the book. The reason being that that's a problem, if you don't have that PHA team documented, you don't really know that expertise that they're bringing. Did you have an operator with 15 years of experience or 3 months of experience? Did you have an engineer? Did you have all of your bases covered? Other discussions that don't get documented sometimes, people get the HAZOP or the what-if checklist, and they do it very in-depth, but a lot of times they'll skimp or ignore human factors in facility siting, external events, or previous incidents especially. Another inconsistency problem would be your risk ranking. You should be across the board, especially when it comes to consequence. A lot of times, say for ammonia refrigeration, your high side and low side, a lot of times you're going to have very, very repeating scenarios, or from at least a consequence standpoint. You need to be making sure that you're ranking it consistently so that way you know that this was exactly what the team felt and you guys are confident in that. An industry accepted approach not used or not used correctly. That kind of ties back into what I was talking about with making sure there's an experienced facilitator. This is in red for a reason, but recommendations not closed in a timely manner. Timely manner was the wording that's been used for years. As part of that January 1st update, you do now have these conditions. Essentially, you have to have it done within 2.5 years of the PHA done, unless you agree upon something, say it's a very big, extensive, large capital project. You can talk with your Coupa, go ahead, and a lot of times they'll be willing to work with you as long as you're upfront and getting out there and letting them know this is something we're going to do, but this is going to cost some money. We need to work this into a long-term budget. Lacking documentation for closed recommendations. This is probably the biggest thing I notice when I do compliance audits. Even if you guys are documenting it, a lot of times that action tracking log or whatever you're using to do it, you keep it blank, and if it isn't kept blank, they'll just say closed. No dates, no signature. You don't know who closed it, when they closed it, what they did to close it. And obviously that's kind of against the spirit of what the recommendation is there for. Did you guys just decide not to action it? Why not? Or did you do an alternative thing? If so, what was it? Why did you feel like that was most important? And also now you need to keep these for the life of the process. That's another change that happened during the January 1st amendments. And the 5-year update now completed by the anniversary. This kind of ties in a lot with anything regarding your dates. Operating procedures. I touched on it earlier, but this is probably the biggest one I noticed, that the annual review is not performed. I would say more times than not during compliance auditing and program review, they aren't being updated, or at least you're not doing some sort of review when you bring operations and the plant management and just go, okay, are we still operating the system as we did? Did we change anything? Do we need to do updates? It's a pretty straightforward process, but it's very easy to overlook. Written procedures not synchronized with operator actions. This is another one. You know, a lot of times, you know, your safety manager or an engineer will write the operating procedure, and there will be workarounds that just everyone in the ops side knows to do. Obviously, that defeats the purpose of the operating procedure if, you know, you are normally operating the system differently than it's intended, because the idea being that you can pick up this piece of paper, read through, and go ahead and operate the system safely. Also, each phase of operation is not listed. A lot of times people have their normal startup, normal operating procedures, normal shutdown. And a lot of times this isn't radically different from, say, an emergency shutdown, startup after an emergency, or some of your temporary operations. But you need to at least make sure that you're documenting that, and then if there are those nuanced changes, instead of just contributing that to operator knowledge and just knowing that they know what to do, going ahead and just making sure that you go ahead and place whatever information up front they need to know, and then you can even just reference back to that normal startup or normal shutdown. Emergency shutdown procedure job assignments are not clear. This one is another one that happens a lot. You have a great emergency shutdown procedure, but it's an emergency. Things are chaotic. People need to know exactly who's doing what and who needs to be doing what when. If they don't, that once again just kind of puts a little entropy into the system, and you could run into some issues. Acceptable alarm set point ranges are not documented. This is another one. It kind of comes into your safety systems. You need to be making sure that people know, you hit your yellow alarm here. This is kind of what it means. This is your readout. Here's your red alarms. Or, you get this high pressure alarm here. What are those set at? So you know kind of when that happens where your system is at. Another common one, especially in certain industries, procedures not in the language of the user. You can write up the best procedures in the world, but if it's in a language or a format that can't be understood easily, it's not doing anyone any good. It's pretty much just going to sit and gather dust at the end of the control room. Consequences of deviation not included. This is a very common problem with operating procedures. It's pretty easy to infuse. You guys are doing PHAs already as part of this program, so you can borrow a lot of that language from your PHA as well as your acceptable ranges and your operating limits. And safe work practice not properly being documented. Training. Documentation of training is not on file. It sounds pretty straightforward, but it's very, very common. It's very difficult, the more employees you have, to be tracking that down and making sure that not just that you're saying, yeah, the training happened, but making sure yes, employee A did this on December 6th, and making sure that everything is closed out and you have the certifications needed. Another one, a lot of times they focus on safety hazards and then your operating procedures, but a lot of times that does not often include maintenance tasks, especially in places that often use contractors. You need to be making sure that those things are being documented. Records do not verify operators' understanding of the procedures. A lot of times you'll put canned wording in there that says, oh yeah, we trained them, they know what they're doing. Periodically you need to be testing, making sure that, yeah, no, these are being operated, not just that the system is working like it's supposed to be, but once again, kind of like I was talking about the operating procedures, that they're operating the system in line with how you expect them to operate that system. If there's a break between how ops does it and engineering thinks you do it, that gap needs to be bridged, because that's allowing some gray area where you could end up with issues. And once again, training not in the language of the user. Mechanical integrity. A lot of times this is contracted out or done by different departments, but making sure your written procedures are available. Basically, a lot of times I'll see that where, no, we do our maintenance, here's our work orders, but it's not documented anywhere in some nice central location. A lot of times also, if you look through it, you might be having your PSV replacements on point. You're checking your set points, you're testing your transmitters, but maybe you miss the big ones, say your 10-year tank inspection, your B109 audits, things like that. Anything like that also needs to be documented. Another big one being piping. Paul touched base on it earlier, but incorrect maintenance and testing on an arm off the crude unit at Chevron Richmond, that was one of the big deciding factors that broke that pipe open. It was not being tested correctly. You need to be making sure that piping as well. That can be a major release point. Your frequency isn't consistent with industry standards. Making sure you're looking at your O&M manuals, things like that, and making sure that what you think is an appropriate maintenance schedule is in line with what these other people provide for you. And equipment deficiencies not correct in a safe or timely manner. You do your daily log sheet, you sign it out, everything's looking good, but you notice a little bit of leaking or, let's say, some ice buildup on a line. It's not supposed to be there. You write it down, you put it in the daily log, you go home. Making sure that that's not only just being handed off to the correct personnel, but management or whomever is in charge of taking that to the next level is following up on it and you're closing it out. You're noting that as an unsafe condition for a reason. You don't want to just rely on it to get done whenever it gets done. Not documenting your preventative maintenance schedule with the contractor. A lot of times facilities just say, hey, this is a knowledgeable contractor. He knows what he's doing. He comes out, he sends us the bill. Make sure that you guys are scheduling that. This is what our contractor is coming out to do on the 6-month frequency, a 1-month frequency. We know exactly what it's doing. His write-up at the end of the day goes ahead and reflects, yes, we completed task A, B, C, D. Quality assurance. Quality assurance plan not in place. This sort of ties back into that verification process, making sure that not only you're doing these things or you're checking the boxes, but that it's actually being done correctly. And sufficient information not available for piping and equipment to understand the hazards and develop a maintenance program. The older system, a lot of times documents will get lost. They maybe got thrown away 10, 15, 20 years ago, and you guys have been operating it blind or something of that nature. If that's the case, work with the contractor, work with the manufacturer, things like that. Make sure that you're not just assuming that this is the best because that's kind of general. Each piece of equipment is different. They might have a more stringent frequency on certain things because of the way that system is built, even though it might be different, say a screw compressor versus reciprocating. With that, like I said, the same thing that, the main thing I would say to take away from that, make sure your mechanical integrity is robust. You're not just doing your PSVs, you're doing your pumps, but make sure you've got your vessels, you've got everything, as well as piping. That's a big one that I see missing a lot of times is there's no inspection for the piping except for maybe operator rounds. Sometimes you need to go ahead and, if that's noted, make sure you're doing ultrasound testing or whatever needs to be done to go ahead and to keep that system safe. Management of change. The first one is kind of a no-brainer deficiency, the procedure not being used. That can be met in a couple different ways. Either you're ignoring the procedure completely, or it's not being followed up as it's supposed to. If you're going ahead and doing this change, make sure that you're not just leaving it and going, okay, we're initiating the change, and that piece of paper sits on somebody's desk. A lot of times that's the big one I see. The MOC was initiated, but it was never followed up on. You never got the signatures, and especially you never closed the thing out, especially if recommendations came out of it. You're noting those as issues that need to be resolved before you start the system back up. I'll touch a little bit more on that in PSSR. But that's the biggest thing I notice is a lot of times that follow-up isn't done. The MOC procedure is being done more as a paperwork exercise rather than an actual safety system. The prevention program documentation is not updated to reflect the changes. This is a similar in vein with what I was talking about with the recommendation. It's very easy to go ahead when you're doing the MOC. You know exactly what you're doing. It's right on your mind. Go ahead and update the entire prevention program while you're doing that, rather than 5 years or 3 years during your compliance audit, noting deficiencies and trying to track down paperwork and issues then. Personnel not adequately notified of the change. As part of all of these regulations, you need to be making sure that you're talking to your contractors, your affected employees, and they know that you're changing the system. The need for modifications to existing operating and maintenance procedures, or whether new procedures are needed, is not assessed. It kind of talks back to that updated reflecting changes. You know, if you're changing equipment, that might change your set points, your operating parameters. If you're not updating your operating procedures, say if somebody goes, well, I'm not really sure about this, grabs the operating procedure and says, okay, this is the set point. If you haven't changed or updated anything, that could potentially end up in a hazard or at least some issues with the system. And the MOC procedure not being completed or signed off prior to startup. That's the biggest one. And then this ties back into the pre-startup safety review. The procedure is not documented. One big problem I see with compliance audits, people don't even do the PSSR, and then after the system's been running for 2 or 3 years already, they'll go ahead and just be like, oh, yep, we did this, we did that. You know, it's a pre-startup safety review for a reason. You need to be making sure that everything's been already addressed before you start the system up. If you do it afterwards, that kind of defeats the purpose of that verification and making sure that everything's been taken into account. Documentation not being kept on file or not completed following implementation. It ties right back into that. And PSSR is not documented or conducted independently of the MOC. A lot of procedures I see, you have the MOC, and in that same exact procedure, you have that PSSR form stapled right onto it, and people do it all at once. The idea being that MOC procedure is, you know, the bulk work of what you're doing, and then that PSSR is there essentially just to verify that the MOC procedure was done correctly, everything that needed to be done was addressed, and then you go ahead and say, yeah, you know, we're comfortable starting the system back up. Compliance auditing, once again, recommendations are not corrected or completed in a timely manner. The timely manner has been phased out. You have a 1.5 years from the audit, or if you need longer time, talking with your Coupa. And the compliance audit not completed by anniversary date. Everyone's oftentimes very, very focused on their 5-year, that big update, that 3-year compliance audit a lot of times slips by the wayside. Maybe you get it done at 3.5, 4 years, or maybe it just completely falls off track. While I do see that it's very easy to lose that side of that, it is very important to make sure that you've got it auditing and keeping up and making sure that everything that's being changed, you're verifying and making sure that it's already been done. It's a lot easier to catch it on a 3-year cycle than if you're doing it every 5 or 6 years, especially if, like I said, the MOC procedures and things like that aren't being followed as stringently as they need to be. No documentation regarding the audit scope, methods used, or findings. It's a very minor thing, but it's very often overlooked. You know, people are very, very, very concerned about documenting everything that they see or don't see, that they don't say, how are we doing this, who's doing it, why are we doing it. Also not involving the correct personnel. You know, you can't just sit there, grab the RMP binder and set it down on your desk and flip through it and say, okay, yeah, we've got wording that covers every one of our bases. Make sure that you're pulling operations, maintenance, you know, plant management, and then verifying some of these things. You'd be surprised how many times I've asked, say, an operator or a maintenance employee, where is the CalARP binder? And they have no clue. And that's obviously an issue. You're going to run into problems with employee participation, things like that if they don't even know where to find your documentation. And also, there's a lot of things that you can write, but if they're not being implemented, it's really just a paperwork exercise. Making sure that they actually are following your operating procedures. They know where things are, what to do in issues. And another one, not having those most 2 recent audits on file. They used to let you throw one away. This is another change from the January 1st regulation. You used to be able to hold on to the 2 unless one was more than 5 years old. Now you have to keep the 2, so essentially you're holding on to them for 6 years. Incident investigation. Once again, I think you're starting to probably pick up on the plan on what I'm going to probably come to later a bit, but no follow through on recommendations. It's like just like the compliance audit, you have a 1.5 years following the investigation to close the recommendation, or 2 years after the date of the incident, whichever one is earlier. If it's a long lead item, You can work with your Coupa. They understand if it's going to be a large capital, but make sure that you've also put something in the interim together to mitigate that risk until you can make that major upgrade. Another one being incident investigation not initiated within 48 hours of the event. That's very often missed, especially if it happens to the end of the week, things like that. Make sure that you guys are launching that and getting the ball rolling as quickly as possible while the memories and everything is still fresh. Required information not documented during the investigation or in report. A lot of times, you'll have a very short incident investigation report. Make sure that you're putting in the adequate amount of information instead of just filling in the bare bones minimum. The more you can put in there and understand what exactly happened, the better it's going to help everyone, especially if you're a large company and you might share it across the board or across the fleet, saying, hey, look, this is something we saw here. Make sure you look for this there. Completion dates not documented for recommendations or deficiencies. And one major one, you're not looking at your near misses. You have a release, everyone's pretty good about documenting their incident investigation. But if it's a near miss, it kind of comes back to this pyramid that they use for CCPS. You have unsafe conditions at the very bottom, say 100,000 of them. It kind of gets a little bit smaller, and then those are kind of your near misses. After that, you might have a loss of containment, but no one got hurt. And then at the very top, very rarely, but it will happen eventually if you keep ignoring it by probability, that there is an incident. Employee participation. Your written plan is not documented and or shared with facility personnel. This comes back to that what I was talking about with compliance auditing. I can't tell you how many times I've gone places and they don't know where documentation is or what I'm even talking about or why I'm here. Personnel involved with the covered process, not aware of the location of the CalARP binder. Personnel not involved with program development. You need to be bringing in as much expertise as possible. It doesn't do anyone any good if you're just writing canned wording. You need to be making sure it's tailored to your facility. The people that are operating and maintaining and engineering there, they need to be the ones that are making the decisions on how this is done or how it should be done. And the documentation is not in the language of the user. That's another very common theme. Hot work permits. This is a pretty easy one, but making sure that people are trained. And then basically making sure that you have those records are documented, you're holding on to them as long as you need to, and it's not being field verified by your supervisors. People will oftentimes just kind of, oh, I know this guy, he does good work. They don't go out there and make sure that's being done correctly, and that obviously, that lack of oversight oftentimes can lead to problems. Contractors, people also do a lot better documenting the training for their own personnel. A lot of times, though, there's next to nothing, if anything at all, regarding the documentation on the training of their actual contractors. There are, overlapping programs that you can go ahead and keep all of your contractor information together with. ISNet World is a very common one, things like that keep all that information for you. But you need to be making sure you have some sort of file that says, no, it wasn't just that our contractors said anyone they send out has, been trained. Make sure you have some sort of file or at least a log sheet from them that says, these are the 5, 6 contractors we bring on site. Yes, they have completed X, Y, Z. Lack of contractor visitor safety training. A lot of times, it's a very easy one to do, like a little pamphlet brochure or maybe a safety video. Hey, right when they come in, they sign up and say that they're on site. It kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone. You're controlling the entry and exit of your facility with that sign-in sheet, and then also, as part of that, verify that, yes, they understand there are hazardous chemicals on site. And then they also understand what they need to be doing. They're not allowed to walk away without personnel. And lack of periodic evaluation of contractors. A lot of contractors have been there for a long time. Maybe that contract owner has been there for a long time, but they bring new people in, new people out. Making sure that you're just periodically evaluating. It's once again just oversight. People can get complacent with a lot of procedures and plans, making sure that you're just going ahead and verifying and making sure that they're doing everything like they're supposed to. Emergency planning and response. A lot of times this is the big one, ERP versus an EAP. Not knowing the difference or not having the correct plan in place. Obviously, if you're going to respond, that's very different than an action plan. And if you're not documenting the two correctly or people aren't being trained correctly, it just adds a lot of chaos kind of like what we're talking about with the operating procedures and emergency situations, not having that clear line of delineation of who's doing what. Also, another big one, not talking with your emergency response requirements with other agents. Fire departments, they like being involved with this. They like to know exactly how you're going to be responding, what's on site. Obviously, it helps them with their response. It helps keep your guys safe, keeps their guys safe, everyone wins. So make sure, you know, it's at least been documented. Ideally, if they can come out and do some training or at least take a look at the facility and know what your layout is like. Contact information also not being up to date. This comes back to CalARP submittal. If you change your emergency contact especially, make sure that you document that. That's kind of the first line people go, and if that cell phone is disconnected, you know, it's adding time that they can't respond or they don't know how to get a hold of somebody. It's just delaying the process in an emergency situation where time is of the essence. Annual review not being completed or documented, and training not being performed or documented. These kind of go hand in hand, but you know, making sure that, you know, it's not just, oh yeah, we built this thing 20 years ago, it's a great emergency response plan. Make sure that you're refreshing on that. Your refresher training is there for a reason. People start to forget little details, or the more you do it, it becomes almost muscle memory rather than, okay, no, this is the next step. Coordinating with the local agencies, that's another big one. It kind of ties back to what we were talking about. Kind of like I hinted at earlier, the most common program-wide deficiency is recommendation follow-up. You know, assign individuals to follow up on recommendation completion. Say after your PHA, you know, you come up with these great action items. What I suggest to people all the time is, once you finish that PHA, go and look, while the whole team is still there, everything's fresh, review it, make sure that the way that was stated makes sense to everybody, it's something you guys want to action on. Then after that, go, okay, let's assign a person and assign a date. So that way there is already that accountability to it instead of somebody just gets a big list and eventually they kind of throw this to somebody, throw that to somebody. Everyone's there. They've all agreed on who's doing what. It really helps a lot with the implementation side of a recommendation. Obviously, make sure you're following those regulatory requirements, 2.5 years for PHAs, year and a half for investigation compliance audits. And like I said earlier too, document your actions. You know, just saying closed leaves it too open-ended. I can never tell what was done. You know, and that way it's kind of defeating the purpose of that recommendation. You don't know what was done. Was that, like I said, was it the actual recommendation? Did you do it as it was stated? Did you come up with a different idea that made more sense? It was safer, but why? You know, or you didn't action it. Why did you not action it? And then also include the date and who was responsible for that decision. It kind of comes back to this basic fundamental principle. If you're not documenting it, it's a deficiency. You know, pinky promising that you did it correctly or anything of that nature, it's really not proving anything. These are kind of things I had alluded to a little bit earlier, but from a regulatory update side of things, OSHA has released 3.5, we'll say, interpretation letters directly involving PSM. Ragged gap enforcement, we're recognizing generally accepted good engineering practices. That's the first one I had talked about. Basically, they're just showing you, okay, you know, everyone says that they're doing this the correct way. You know, there's usually a sentence on your PSI that says, oh, this is being designed, operated, and maintained in line with industry best practices. But that's it. Make sure that you're actually documenting, no, this is what we're doing to maintain this piece of equipment. You know, this is how we're complying with that. Retail exemption. This has got a lot of people paying a lot of attention right now because this has been kind of gone back and forth a lot of times when it comes to regulation. They've released several different interpretations on what retail is. Now they've gone ahead and released a letter of enforcement basically saying that if you don't have that SIC code of 44 or 45, you're not eligible for that exemption. That especially applies to, say, fertilizer companies. Fertilizer companies, since they've been taking anhydrous, aqueous, and going ahead and making that, and then they're not the end user, the farmer is. They've oftentimes taken that retail exemption. OSHA's closing that. Enforcement, they initially were saying this is where the half the letter comes from. They were going to go January 2016. I think they've gotten a lot of pushback, and a lot of people aren't quite prepared yet. So they're going to go ahead and they gave it another 6 months. So it'll be July 2016 when they'll be enforcing that. And the covered concentration, basically they've always saying commercial grade was the original approach. They realized that there are obviously different commercial grades. It's very difficult to nail down what exactly that one was supposed to mean. So they're going to go towards the EPA's distinction of a 1% concentration rule. Just to go ahead, and I know a lot of people kind of are immediately freaking out about that, especially when it comes to aqua ammonia. That doesn't apply to ones that have a specified concentration. So, you know, your 52%, your 44%, if it's stated on there, that does not apply. It's only for those that do not have a specified concentration. Also, there's supposed to be more coming out, so keep your eyes out. Make sure you're doing this. In case you didn't know, they had an RFI a while back. They're in the process of writing new regulations, and these 3 things were on there. So those new enforcement letters that are probably coming down the pipeline, I would be very surprised if there aren't 1 or 2 other things off that RFI list that they're going to go ahead and try and roll out early, so that way it's not as much of a shock to the system when that new PSM regulation rolls out. From California, Senate Bill 612, it's in the pipeline. CUPAs now have a general duty clause if that one rolls out as it's intended. This is in line with EPA RMP, which is obviously the basis for the CalARP regulation. It gives them the ability to, hey, you know, this is something I've noticed. I don't think this, while it's not deficient, I think you can improve the system very easily by doing this. Also requires different things regarding mapping and underground and above ground storage tanks, spill prevention and countermeasures, and hazardous waste. I attached the link to that Senate bill as it stands right now. You guys can download the presentations. Kim talked about that earlier. If you want the link or talk to me, I can email it to you. Status and what to expect. CalARP, they already rolled out the new amendments. We've been talking about those a little bit with the nuanced details. January 1st, 2015. Those are in effect. They are being enforced as they stand. Program 4, this is for the refinery sector. It's the PSM for refineries kind of thing. It's due in mid-2016. They're working pretty hard. Paul Penn and a couple of the other guys have been very actively involved in that. CalOSHA has the exact same thing. They're calling it 5189.1, just adding a 0.1 to their PSM standard. And it's going to be rolling out almost the exact same time. They're developing these in tandem. There's a lot of overlap between the two. US EPA, they're supposed to be getting the proposed rulemaking out, I said soon. Initially what I'd read was September 2015. Hasn't been released yet though, so keep an eye out. It should be coming up pretty soon. And FedOSHA, I talked about that with the enforcement letters, but they're looking at the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Act, their SFREVPA, and they did that in June. They haven't really released any updates since then, but it's very much a priority item. Dan talked about Executive Order 13650. That's what spurned a lot of this. So they're under a lot of gun from the Senate as well. They have had several hearings where they've really gotten beaten up because they haven't got these things out as quickly as they would have wanted. And then I just put some general references and other things on there. Like I said, you can take a look at those at a later date. There's my email address, my card's in the back table as well if you have any questions. And then we're also going to be bringing up the panel here pretty soon.